Okay, let's unpack this. When you picture the Victorian era, what images come to mind? Maybe stern portraits, elaborate gowns, tightly buttoned suits, and a general air of restraint. The period often synonymous with intense prudishness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very buttoned up.
Right. But what if I told you that beneath that seemingly buttoned-up surface, something radically different, even counterintuitive, was bubbling up? Something that involved harnessing the most powerful energy in the universe, sexual energy for spiritual and even material ends.
It does seem like a total contradiction, doesn't it? How could the very era we associate with repression and silence around sex simultaneously be the birthplace of a sophisticated, detailed body of work on what became known as sexual magic?
Exactly.
That paradox is really at the heart of our deep dive today.
Absolutely. And that's exactly where it gets really interesting. We're plunging into the world of Magia Sexualis, the explicit linking of the forces often called eros and magic, particularly within Western esoteric traditions as the 19th century transitioned into the 20th.
Our guide for this journey is a fascinating analysis of this topic, drawing insights from research and articles that meticulously examine the key figures involved and the complex cultural context they emerged from.
Our mission is straightforward: to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge from this source material. We want to help you understand this peculiar intersection of sex and the occult. What were these practitioners actually doing? Why did this tradition emerge then?
And what does this strange history tell us about society, not just in the past, but right now in our own time? It's quite relevant, actually.
Definitely. We'll be focusing our attention on three central and often quite scandalous figures. First, the intriguing American spiritualist Paschal Beverly Randolph. Then, the notorious figure often called the Great Beast 666, Aleister Crowley.
Ah, yes, Crowley.
And finally, the founder of what's considered the first tantric order in America, Pierre Bernard.
Okay, quite a lineup.
And here's one of those surprising findings that starts to emerge from the analysis right away. These figures weren't simply straightforward rebels kicking against the system. Our sources suggest they both reflected and subverted the values and tensions of their era in incredibly complex ways.
Right. It wasn't just rebellion for rebellion's sake.
No. And in doing so, they actually foreshadowed a lot of our own society's complicated relationship with sex and the powerful, sometimes ambivalent idea of its liberation.
So, to truly appreciate these figures and their practices, we need to set the scene. What was the real deal with sex in the Victorian era and the period immediately following? We often hear that it was simply an age of extreme repression where sex was never talked about, consigned to silence.
Right. That's the common picture, often called the repressive hypothesis. But the French philosopher Michel Foucault famously challenged this idea quite strongly.
Foucault had a very different take.
His argument was that the Victorian era wasn't about silencing sex at all. In fact, he argued, it was quite the opposite. The 19th century, in his view, dedicated itself to speaking of sex ad infinitum.
Endlessly.
The intense focus wasn't on not talking about it, but on categorizing it, classifying it, medicalizing it, pathologizing it, and endlessly detailing it crucially while exploiting it as a secret.
That idea, exploiting it as a secret, is really key to understanding this period and the rise of sexual magic. The late 19th century wasn't silent. It saw an unprecedented explosion of discourse about sex.
Right.
Medical texts, psychological studies, social reformers, even pornography, they all contributed to this constant churn of talk, often detailed and titillating, particularly focusing on what was labeled as deviant or abnormal sexuality.
So this new literature on sexual magic, strange as it might seem, actually emerged as part of this larger cultural fascination, not entirely isolated from it. It was a new way of speaking about sex, albeit a very unconventional one.
Definitely. Now, it's true that the idea of a connection between illicit sexuality and secret, sometimes scandalous rituals, has a long history in the Western imagination.
Oh yeah, you see it everywhere.
You see it in the accusations hurled against Gnostic heresies in the early Christian era, during the persecution of the Knights Templar in the Middle Ages, and certainly throughout the various waves of witch hunts. Secret rites were often assumed to involve sexual transgression.
It was almost the default assumption, wasn't it? If it's secret, it must be sexual.
Pretty much. But what our source material highlights is that the mid-19th century marked a distinct turning point. This was the birth of detailed, systematic sexual magic. Before this, the connection was more about accusation, rumor, or metaphor. Now we see specific instructions and theories being developed.
And it's important to be precise about what we mean by sexual magic in this context, based on the sources. This isn't just using the concept of sexual union as a metaphor for, say, the soul uniting with God or the merging of complementary cosmic principles.
Although those metaphors definitely exist in mysticism.
Right. This is the explicit, practical use of actual sexual intercourse, masturbation, or other forms of sexual activity and genital orgasm as a direct source of creative magical power.
Like a tangible force.
Exactly. This power was seen as a tangible force that could be harnessed, directed, and manipulated to achieve specific results, whether spiritual, psychological, or material.
And happening concurrently with this development was an increasing intermingling of long-standing Western occult traditions, Hermeticism, Kabbalah, Freemasonry, spiritualism, with practices and philosophies flowing in from the East, particularly Indian Tantra.
Ah, the Tantric connection.
Yeah, this cross-pollination was crucial and definitely contributed to the specific forms that Western sexual magic took.
That's a point worth dwelling on, especially looking at its legacy today. The sources note that much of what is marketed and understood today as modern Tantra or sacred sex in the West isn't a direct, pure transmission of Indian Tantra.
No, not usually.
Instead, it's often a complex melding of this 19th century Western sexual magic tradition with what our source describes as a somewhat garbled version of Indian Tantra.
Right, it's a hybrid. Understanding this historical fusion is key to understanding modern expressions of sacred sex.
It really is. And returning to those central figures, Randolph, Crowley, Bernard, the analysis, argues they weren't simply radical countercultural figures. They were, in fact, intense embodiments and reflections of some of the deepest ideals, tensions, and contradictions that defined modernity itself.
Like what sort of things?
Ideas like the belief in inevitable progress, the rise of radical individualism, the emphasis on free will as a supreme force, and what some scholars call the sacralization of the self, the idea that the individual self contains ultimate truth or divinity.
Okay.
Their intense focus on sexuality, seeing it as a core essence of that self, and their belief in its potential for liberation really exemplify these modern tensions.
And why sex, specifically? Why did it become so central?
Well, as modernity developed, there was an increasing tendency in Western thought to identify sexuality as the fundamental secret of life, the innermost essence of the body, the core drive. It wasn't just about procreation anymore.
Right, it became about identity, health.
Exactly. It was seen as crucial for individual health, psychological well-being, and even productivity within modern capitalist society. You see this trajectory leading directly towards figures like Freud, who argued that the liberation of sexual energy, once suppressed, was essential for both personal psychological health and the health of society as a whole.
Yes, and this brings us back to Foucault's nuanced view. That alleged liberation of sex might not have been a radical break from power structures, but rather another phase in that long history of preoccupation and control.
It's not really liberation.
More like a move towards an increasing obsession, hyperdevelopment of discourse around sex, and significantly, its increasing commodification within consumer capitalism. The potential for liberating power that these sexual magicians saw in their practices, our sources suggest, was always a bit ambivalent, tangled up in these broader societal shifts.
It's that powerful paradox.
Yeah.
Constantly talking about sex, classifying it, elevating it to this fundamental status, seeing it as key to health and selfhood, while simultaneously trying to control it, categorize it, or market it. It's anything but silent.
Precisely. So with that complex backdrop set, let's turn our attention to a figure who is credited with perhaps being the first to develop a truly detailed, systematic method of sexual magic, Paschal Beverly Randolph.
Randolph is a truly fascinating and I think often overlooked figure in this history. Born in 1825, his background is quite intriguing.
Yeah, really intriguing.
He was the son of a wealthy white Virginia father and a mother who was a slave from Madagascar. He was raised in poverty, became self-taught, was orphaned at a young age, and traveled the world extensively as a young man.
Wow.
He rose to significant prominence as a leading American spiritualist and was particularly famous as a scryer, someone who could gain insights by gazing into crystal balls or other reflective surfaces.
But his interests weren't confined to the occult. Our source material highlights that he was a passionate social advocate. He advocated strongly for Black rights during the Civil War era and was even called one of the century's great feminists for his views on women's equality.
A feminist in the 19th century, that's notable.
It really is. His life, despite its early successes, ended tragically, though. He became paralyzed after an accident and later died by suicide in 1875.
Such a complex figure. So what was his core idea regarding sexual magic?
He termed it affectional alchemy. For him, sexual love wasn't just about personal connection. He saw it as nothing less than the greatest hope for the regeneration of the world.
Wow, that's a huge claim.
It was, in his view, absolutely key to achieving personal fulfillment, driving social transformation, and forming the basis of what he envisioned as a truly non-repressive civilization.
Where did he get these ideas? Did he invent them?
Well, he claimed that his profound knowledge of these mysteries came from his extensive travels and encounters with various esoteric traditions. He mentioned studying with Sufi lineages, for example.
Yeah.
He had a famous, perhaps legendary claim that he learned the ultimate secrets of sex magic in Jerusalem or Bethlehem from a dusky maiden.
Sounds a bit romanticized, maybe.
Possibly. The sources note speculation about whether he might have encountered some form of tantra during his travels to the East, but they find no solid evidence to definitively support this claim.
Interesting.
There is also speculation that he might have affiliated with a group of fakirs in the Middle East, possibly the Nusayri, an esoteric Islamic group who were historically accused of engaging in Gnostic-like sexual rituals. So the exact origin is somewhat shrouded in mystery, but his synthesis was certainly unique.
So what was the fundamental teaching?
His fundamental teaching was that the sexual instinct was the most fundamental, potent power in the entire universe. He described it using language borrowed from the magnetic attraction theories popular at the time.
Like Mesmer.
Exactly. Figures like Franz Anton Mesmer. He saw the male and female principles as complementary electromagnetic forces, but polarized differently depending on the plane of existence.
So.
That's a fascinating detail. He believed that on the physical plane, the male principle was positive and the female negative, but he reversed this on the mental plane, seeing the female mind as positive and the male mind as negative. This inherent, divinely ordained polarization created a powerful, undeniable attraction, a magnetic rapport that was the engine of both physical procreation and spiritual creation.
And orgasm was key.
Absolutely central. For Randolph, the moment of orgasm was absolutely critical to this magical process. He viewed it not just as a physical climax, but as the precise instant when new life, new energy, or new influence is drawn from the spiritual realm into the material world.
Like a conduit opening up.
Precisely. It was, in his words, the crucial instant when the soul was opened up, becoming receptive to cosmic energies. He taught that anything then truly willed is accomplished in that incredibly potent, receptive moment.
Wow. He had a striking quote about this moment, didn't he? Something about damnation or energy.
Yes, saying that the moment a man discharges his seed, breathing either fetid damnation from the lower corrupting realms or divine energy from the heavens, whatsoever he truly wills at that moment is answered by the universe.
Intense. So it could go either way, good or bad.
Exactly. This highlights the dual potential he saw in this power. Used with pure intent and directed upwards, it could lead to spiritual transcendence and connection. But misused or directed towards negative ends, it could lead the soul downward towards corruption and ruin.
And the scope of uses he outlined for this power was incredibly broad. It wasn't confined to just spiritual matters, right?
Not at all. He listed over 100 distinct applications for his affectional alchemy. These ranged from increasing the power and potential of an unborn child or influencing and controlling one's spouse.
Influencing your spouse.
To more external applications like regaining youth, prolonging life, attaining supreme white magic or love, and even furthering financial interests, he explicitly mentioned using it for schemes and lotteries.
Lotteries? Seriously?
Seriously. Other uses he listed included attaining the loftiest insight, frustrating bad plans directed against you, successful money dealings, achieving domestic happiness, and even, somewhat darkly, deranging love relations of others. It was presented as an all-purpose magical engine.
But a really distinctive feature of Randolph's system, and one that really sets him apart from some later practitioners, was his absolute insistence on the importance of mutual orgasm, right?
Yes, that's crucial. For the magic to be truly successful, powerful, and beneficial, both partners had to be actively involved and reach climax, ideally simultaneously.
He was quite explicit about this.
Very. He stated clearly that the paroxysm of both is necessary, and that the woman's orgasm must coincide with the man's emission for the magical operation to be fulfilled. He didn't see the woman's role as passive.
No, she was an active participant.
Exactly. Her own climax was vital to generating and directing the energy. He described the resulting experience not just as physical pleasure, but as the overflowing joy of the divine, the very breath of God, a celestial aura bathing both bodies and refreshing both souls.
It's quite beautiful, actually.
Right.
And as we mentioned, he saw this potential for sexual power or liberation as intrinsically linked to broader social change.
He wasn't just an armchair magician.
No, he was a fervent abolitionist, actively supporting Southern slaves and working to enlist black soldiers during the Civil War. The sources mention his rousing speech in Syracuse, where he called passionately for black freedom and a new social vision, declaring, "We are coming up."
Wow.
For Randolph, the regeneration of the world through affectional alchemy included a vision of personal freedom leading to social liberation.
It's not surprising, given his teachings and his social activism, that Randolph's writings and public profile generated considerable fear and suspicion within mainstream Victorian American culture.
Oh, I bet.
He was accused of distributing immoral, free love literature, which he denied, emphasizing his focus on marriage. He was even arrested in 1872 on charges related to his teachings.
He was arrested. What happened?
He was clever, though, and he actually used that arrest to his advantage. He published a fictional trial transcript of the event where he humorously portrays the prosecutor as being unable to find any genuinely scandalous accusations, saying there was nothing worse to say than that Randolph encouraged women to think of themselves as equals to men.
Huh. That tells you a lot, doesn't it?
It really tells you a lot about the kinds of anxieties he was provoking at the time. But our source material makes a crucial point. Despite the fear and scandal he generated, Randolph's practice wasn't simply about promoting hedonistic license. In many ways, it embodied many of the values that Victorian society held dear, or at least paid lip service to.
Like?
His teachings were strictly intended for married couples, emphasizing pure intentions and adherence to moral and physical sanctions.
Okay, so still quite structured. He certainly wrestled with that deep Victorian tension about the power of sex. Victorians, far from ignoring sex, were obsessed with its perceived power, seen as potentially creative and regenerative, but also incredibly destructive and corrupting if uncontrolled.
Right. It was something they believed needed to be contained and controlled, ideally within the bounds of marriage, which they saw as rooted in a spiritual ideal of love.
Yeah.
Our source points out that Victorians believed strongly in the omnipresence and power of the sex instinct and were acutely aware of the potential dangers of excess and ruin.
And perhaps most significantly for the trajectory of this history, Randolph played a crucial role in foreshadowing a major shift that occurred later in the Victorian era, roughly between 1880 and 1900.
What shift was that?
This was the gradual move from the spiritualization of love, where marriage was seen as a spiritual union and sex was an obligation within that, to the sexualization of love. In this later view, sex became seen as a vital, essential component of love itself, even a sign of true affection and intimacy, rather than something potentially dangerous or merely procreative to be contained within the spiritual bond.
Okay, so sex becomes proof of love, in a way.
Exactly. His emphasis on the incredible, almost supernatural power of sex certainly contributed to this cultural shift, making the idea of sex as a powerful central force more prominent. So whether you label him a reformer, a mystic, or a provocateur, Randolph undeniably released a potent idea into Western esotericism.
As our source material puts it, the genie had been released from the bottle, and this led to a flourishing of sexual mysticism in various forms.
And that brings us to our next figure, who took that genie out of the marriage chamber and, well, let's just say he didn't just think outside the box, he tried to shatter the box entirely. We're talking about Aleister Crowley.
Right, the great beast himself. Yes, the transmission of Randolph's ideas happened through various channels. One key vector was groups like the Ordo Templi Orientis, or OTO.
OTO.
As Randolph's ideas spread, they were not just adopted but transformed, often incorporating acts like masturbation and homosexual intercourse into their magical systems, acts that would have been profoundly shocking and unacceptable within Randolph's marriage-focused teachings.
A definite departure.
The OTO became a pivotal organization in the transmission and fusion of Western occultism with Eastern ideas, particularly a Western interpretation of Tantra. It was founded by figures like Karl Kellner and Theodore Reese, with Kellner claiming to have received initiation into Indian sexual techniques, what's sometimes called the left-hand path or sexual magic, during his travels.
But there's another theory about their inspiration, isn't there?
Yes, there's a compelling alternative view presented in the sources, suggesting that Randolph, possibly through the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, HB of L, was actually the primary inspiration for the OTO's sexual magic system.
The HB of L.
Right. The HB of L made sexual magic magic central to its teachings, but also warned of its inherent dangers, even citing Randolph's tragic life as a cautionary tale against excess. The HBFL appears to have played a significant, though often overlooked, role in getting Randolph's works circulating within later occult orders.
Interesting connection. So, what was the OTO's core focus?
Regardless of the precise lineage, the OTO's sexual magic kernel was central to its highest, most secret grades. They explicitly claimed that this was the key to unlocking the deepest Masonic and Hermetic secrets, providing the answers to nature's riddles, explaining religious systems, and decoding obscure symbolism.
They were quite bold about it.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
The Order's journal, Oriflamme, in 1912, boldly proclaimed that the OTO possessed the key of sexual magic. Their degree system was structured around exploring sex magic theory and techniques.
What was the promise?
The promise was that by focusing one's will and imagination intensely at the moment of orgasm, one could achieve success in virtually any occult operation. This ranged from invoking specific deities or entities to finding hidden treasure, and notably empowering magical talismans by anointing them with sexual fluids after auto or heterosexual orgasm.
Okay, so very practical applications in there for you.
And then, of course, came Aleister Crowley, undeniably the most infamous and, frankly, sensational member, self-styled the Great Beast 666.
He certainly courted that image.
Absolutely. While the popular press loved to portray him as a simple king of depravity, arch-traitor, and drug fiend, more recent scholarly analysis, like our source material, tends to see him as a much more complex figure, a powerful reflection of the cultural forces at play in the early 20th century.
Tell us about his background.
Born Edward Alexander Crowley in 1875, the son of a strict puritanical Plymouth Brethren minister, he seems to have embodied some of the deepest, most explosive tensions within late British Victorian culture.
A rebel from the start.
You could say that. He was highly intelligent, educated at Cambridge, inherited a significant amount of money, and dedicated himself to pursuits like poetry, mountaineering, and occult arts. He dramatically adopted the name Aleister and courted scandal early on, publishing overtly erotic poetry, most notably a collection titled White Stains, which led to legal trouble.
White Stains, okay.
He was initiated into the influential Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a key group in Western Esotericism at the time.
But the real turning point was the Book of the Law, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The defining moment for him came in 1904 in Cairo, Egypt, when he claimed to have received a channeled text called the Book of the Law from a praeterhuman entity named Aiwass, described as a minister of the Egyptian god Horus.
Aiwass.
This revelation, for Crowley, marked the dawn of a new era, a new eon, the eon of Horus, which was to replace the previous ages associated with Isis and Osiris.
And the core principle.
The central guiding principle of this new eon was enshrined in the law of Thelema. Thelema is the Greek word for will, and its most famous maxim is, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law."
Which sounds like.
Crowley didn't interpret this as simple hedonism or do whatever you want. For him, it meant the full affirmation of the true self, the uncovering and free expression of one's unique individual will, seeing each person as their own center of the cosmos, sovereign and self-directed.
Okay, so it's about discovering your true purpose and doing it.
Essentially, yes. And central to the practice of Thelema was sexual magic. Crowley viewed sex as the most powerful force available to humans, the supreme expression of the will. He believed it had been stupidly and damagingly repressed by traditional religion, particularly Christianity, leading to all sorts of psychological and social ills.
He had some strong words about that suppression.
He did. He is quoted saying the suppression creates an abscess within the psyche, leading inevitably to distortion, neurosis, and ends in explosion.
So the Book of the Law was the answer.
In his view, yes. It offered the solution by declaring that each individual had an absolute right to satisfy their sexual instinct physiologically. The crucial point, however, was that all such acts were to be treated not as mere physical release, but as sacraments, sacred, intentional acts directed by the will.
Treating sex acts as sacraments, that's a radical reframing.
Hugely radical. Crowley consciously blended his knowledge of Tantra, which he gained through his travels and studies in India and Sri Lanka, with the Western esoteric tradition he inherited from influences like Randolph and the OTO. He's often seen as a key figure in bridging these traditions, though he did so in a highly idiosyncratic and transgressive manner.
How did he change the OTO structure?
His revisions of the OTO degree structure when he took leadership of the order were particularly revealing. The higher degrees were explicitly focused on exploring the magical potential of sexual acts, with an increasing emphasis on practices that were non-reproductive.
This is where he really departs from Randolph.
Absolutely. The 8th degree, for example, focused on autoeroticism, the magical uses of masturbation. Techniques included masturbating over a magical sigil or meditating intensely on the phallus to generate power or establish communication with entities.
The 9th degree.
The 9th degree involved heterosexual intercourse, similar to Randolph's core practice, but here the magical application explicitly involved the consumption of sexual fluids or anointing objects with them, often on a sigil, to attract specific entities or forces to fulfill wishes and empower magical talismans.
Consuming fluids.
Okay. And the 11th?
And the 11th degree, which is described as being mostly homosexual, involved identifying with the ejaculating penis as a source of power and using blood or excrements from anal intercourse in magical operations, often with the stated goal of attracting spirits or demons, with sperm then used to keep them energized or alive.
Wow. Blood excrement. You really went there. He did. What stands out here is how Crowley's most advanced rites centered around explicit acts of transgression. These were calculated inversions of conventional morality and religion. Unlike Randolph, who worked within a reinterpreted framework of Victorian marriage, Crowley actively sought to shatter those boundaries.
The ultimate taboo breaking.
Exactly. The oral consumption of semen or vaginal fluid for Crowley became the supreme elixir, a sacred substance charged with divine power.
And this played out at the Abbey of Thelema.
Very much so. He took these extreme practices to his experimental magical community, the Abbey of Thelema, which he established in Sicily between 1920 and 1923. Here, he genuinely believed he had transcended ordinary moral bounds, making even traditionally defiling substances divine sacraments.
Are there specific examples?
The sources recount anecdotes that illustrate this vividly. For example, during a Gnostic Mass ceremony he performed, the sacred host, the traditional bread of communion, was replaced with his consort's excrement. He then forced her to eat it, proclaiming it the true body of God.
Oh my God.
He described intense physical and spiritual effects resulting from this, along with her apparent compulsion to obey.
That's deeply disturbing. What about the goat sacrifice?
Another striking and frankly disturbing anecdote from 1921 describes a goat sacrifice ceremony at the Abbey. A goat was meant to be beheaded at the precise moment it was having intercourse with his scarlet woman, Leah Hersig. Crowley would then drink its blood from a ritual chalice he called the Cup of Our Lady of Whoredom.
Unbelievable. Did it happen as planned?
The source notes with a certain dry historical observation that the goat was apparently uncooperative, forcing Crowley himself to complete the sexual part of the ritual before its beheading.
Wow. Was there a philosophy behind this, or is it just shock value?
These weren't just random acts of shock value, though they certainly had that effect. Our source connects this directly to the work of the French philosopher Georges Bataille and his concept of transgression.
Bataille. How does he fit in?
Bataille saw transgression not as simple rebellion or breaking rules arbitrarily, but as a fundamental dialectic between taboo and transgression, between sanctity and sacrilege. It's about systematically constructing societal laws and boundaries, and then deliberately, ritualistically overstepping them.
So the violation itself is the point.
In a way, yes. The stricter the taboo, the more powerful and potentially sacred the experience of violating it becomes. Bataille is famously quoted citing the Marquis de Sade, saying that limiting desires is the best way to enlarge them. The prohibition intensifies the desire for violation.
Okay, I see the connection.
And for Bataille, transgression wasn't just destructive. It could bring an ecstatic sense of continuity, a communion with the fundamental energies of life and death, an awareness of the void that led to a sense of exaltation. Ecstasy begins where horror is sloughed off, he wrote. This sense of blissful liberation comes precisely from the act of overstepping limits.
Now that applies directly to Crowley.
Absolutely. He systematically violated the deepest moral, religious, and social boundaries of the Victorian Christian world he came from. By sacralizing acts like masturbation, homosexuality, and the consumption of bodily fluids, all profoundly taboo, he sought to access power and experience states of consciousness that were strictly forbidden by conventional society.
What were his ultimate goals with this magic? Spiritual material?
Both, really. His goals certainly included high spiritual aspirations, communion or intercourse with gods and divine forces, but they were also intensely practical. Crowley openly used occult manipulations for mundane purposes, like trying to raise quick cash when his funds were low.
Interesting. And what about the divine child idea?
Yes. He had a grand, almost terrifying, overarching ambition related to his sexual magic, achieving supreme spiritual power by conceiving a divine child or a spiritual fetus that would somehow transcend ordinary mortality.
The immortal child.
Yes. He believed this quest lay at the heart of many esoteric traditions that involved what he saw as non-normal procreation practices like incest, bestiality, homosexuality, or attempts to create homunculi, because he believed these acts produced unique magical results outside the normal cycle of life. Messianic potential, really.
So comparing him directly to Victorian norms, the contrast is stark.
Absolutely. Victorian society highly valued heterosexual marriage primarily for social stability, economic productivity, and the controlled reproduction of the population. Healthy sexuality was seen as useful, efficient, and leading directly to marriage and family.
Anything outside that was problematic.
Problematic and obsessed over. Any forms of sexuality that didn't fit this narrow, productive model were, as Foucault noted, not ignored, but classified and medicalized. Think of texts like Krafft-Ebing's Magia Sexualis, which cataloged deviations endlessly under the guise of medical science and moral outrage.
Right, like masturbation.
Masturbation, for instance, was almost universally condemned, seen as causing physical decay and even insanity. Homosexuality was viewed as a violation of the fundamental borders of masculinity and a profound threat to the social body. Crowley deliberately embraced and more radically sacralized these very acts.
He was certainly part of the broader early 20th century reaction against Victorian prudery, alongside figures like Havelock Ellis.
Yes, and D.H. Lawrence.
Who explored sexuality, frankly.
Yeah.
But Crowley went significantly further.
Much further. He wasn't just advocating for more openness. He was deliberately setting out to destroy what he saw as the sterile, productive social order through acts of excess, consumption, and ritual transgression. He fundamentally violated the sacred boundary Christianity had erected between religion and sensuality, making sex the ultimate sacrament and bodily fluids, semen, blood, even excrement the sacred elements in his rites.
In a way, our source suggests, Crowley anticipated aspects of the sexual revolutions of the 1960s and 70s, with their emphasis on sexual freedom and challenging norms.
Definitely. But perhaps even more chillingly, he anticipated aspects of our own age. An age characterized by mass consumption and an almost obsessive fascination with sex and transgression, where shocking boundaries is a form of currency.
There's that provocative quote.
Right. One scholar quoted in the source offers a provocative thought, saying it's just as well that Crowley was ahead of his time. Had he been unleashed today, amidst our contemporary fixations on sex and scandal, he might have taken the world by storm. His conscious, deliberate embrace of transgression continues to exert a powerful influence on modern occultism and the fringes of culture.
So we've seen Randolph pioneering a systematic, if still marriage-focused, sex magic. We've seen Crowley push it to extremes of transgression and deliberate violation of taboos. Now let's look at Pierre Bernard, who took a version of this fusion of Western magic and Eastern Tantra to America and added another layer: unapologetic commercialization.
Yes, the increasing merger of Western sexual magic traditions with interpretations of Tantra often led to confusion and simplified understandings. Pierre Bernard was a pivotal figure in this transmission and fusion, specifically in America.
And Tantra itself.
Yeah, it gets simplified.
Very often. As an Asian tradition originating in India, it uses the body, pleasure, and even sex as a path to spiritual liberation. It always had a certain scandalous reputation in its own context, but in the West, it frequently became simplified and rebranded as simply spiritual sex or sacred sex.
Enter Pierre Bernard.
Exactly. Bernard was a wonderfully colorful, mysterious, and often scandalous figure in the American press, where he was frequently referred to as the omnipotent
The omnipotent Great name.
Isn't it? He arrived on the scene claiming to have brought the secret keys of Tantra directly from the Orient and founded what is widely regarded as the first Tantric order in America in 1906. He faced constant controversy, primarily centered around the alleged sexual freedom he encouraged among his followers.
Our source material positions him as an archetype of American Tantra. Yes, vividly foreshadowing the later, more widely known commercialization of Eastern spiritual practices, particularly those involving sex and personal growth, by figures like Rajneesh or Osho.
What was Bernard's background? Was it as exotic as he claimed?
Well, he went to great lengths to conceal his early life using various fictitious identities like Peter Coons. He spun elaborate tales of extensive travel and study in exotic locales like Kashmir and Bengal, claiming to have been initiated into genuine tantric lineages and returning to America as a doctor.
A self-made myth.
Seems likely. He first gained some public notice for his unusual skills in hypnosis and demonstrating the ability to simulate death using yogic techniques around 1900.
His early ventures quickly attracted controversy, right, in San Francisco?
Yes. In 1904, his Bachante Academy in San Francisco, which taught self-hypnosis and yoga, was the subject of press scandal, with accusations that it catered to young women interested in exploring the mysteries of relations between the sexes. This led to legal troubles, though he was acquitted. After the 1906 earthquake, he moved his base to New York City.
And set up the Oriental Sanctum.
That's right, in 1910. This establishment cleverly separated its activities. Hatha yoga classes were offered downstairs for public consumption, while secret tantric initiations and practices took place upstairs.
Upstairs, downstairs.
Classic. This setup quickly became a magnet for scandal in the metropolitan press. He was again charged, this time with kidnapping, based on the testimony of a follower named Zella Hop. While the charges were ultimately dropped, Hop's statement that Bernard was the most wonderful man and that women were simply unable to resist his influence fueled the sensationalism.
Wow. The New York Sanskrit College also caused a stir.
Controversy over that, too. Reports described hearing wild Oriental music and women's cries, adding with a nudge and a wink that these were not those of distress, further highlighting the sexually charged atmosphere surrounding his activities.
So he moves out of the city.
By 1918, seeking perhaps a less scrutinized environment or simply expanding his operation, Bernard purchased a large estate in Nyack, New York, and renamed it the Clarkstown Country Club. He envisioned it as a utopian tantric community.
What was his description? Something whimsical.
Yeah, a place he described as a place where the philosopher may dance and the fool be provided with a thinking cap. He also continued his urban presence, opening additional tantric clinics in New York City and Long Island.
And these clinics weren't catering to just anyone.
No, absolutely not. They attracted a surprisingly affluent and elite clientele, members of prominent families like the Vanderbilts and famous figures from the arts like composer Cyril Scott and conductor Leopold Stokowski.
The society pages must have loved it.
Oh, Town and Country magazine reported on his establishment, described limousines pulling up, a marble foyer, a pretty secretary, and luxurious appointments. Bernard achieved rapid wealth and fame. He was, according to accounts, showered with money by his disciples.
Became a sort of guru figure.
He became a chieftain of his tribe, with over 200 followers, many of them from the best-known names in America. He himself described his persona as a curious combination of the businessman and the religious scholar, a description that is incredibly telling.
Businessman and religious scholar. Sums it up. It's fascinating that our source notes the significant parallels between Bernard's life and scandals and those of Aleister Crowley.
Right, they were kind of operating in parallel, tapping into similar currents.
There was even a direct intersection involving Crowley's Scarlet Woman.
Yes, a brief, direct intersection. Crowley's famous Scarlet Woman, Leah Herzig, had a sister named Alma Herzig. Alma was a devoted disciple of Pierre Bernard, rising to become a high priestess of in his organization.
High priestess of
Before later writing a sensational expose of her time with him titled My Life in a Love Cult.
Wow. The sisters Herzig, caught up in these different but related worlds.
Our source highlights the specific parallel between Alma Herzig serving as a high priestess for Bernard and her sister Leah Herzig serving as Crowley's Scarlet Woman. It's a potent symbol of how these intertwined traditions of Western sexual magic and reinterpreted Tantra were impacting society, attracting figures who sought transformation and notoriety, leading both high priests and their consorts to face intense media attack due to their explicit sexual practices.
Secrecy was a big part of Bernard's operation too, wasn't it?
Deeply emphasized. He described his Kula system as an ancient, powerful tradition that needed to be strictly guarded from uninitiated beasts. Details from police raids on his establishments reveal the layers of secrecy. Disciples needed to know a secret signal, a certain number of taps on a bell to gain entry.
Sounds like a speakeasy.
A bit. There was a clear hierarchy, with public yoga classes downstairs, but a truly secret inner circle upstairs. Requirements for joining this inner circle were demanding. Large sums of money were required, and recruits reportedly had to sign their names in blood after undergoing physical examinations.
Signing in blood, intent.
This emphasis on secrecy wasn't just about traditional esoteric practice. It played directly into and benefited from early 20th century American anxieties about sex, making the forbidden allure even stronger and allowing him to operate outside scrutiny.
So what was the core practice, the philosophy he was teaching?
At the heart of Bernard's practice, based on the source material, was the full embrace and enjoyment of the body and sexual pleasure as a path to the divine. An article in the International Journal, associated with his order, quoted a tantric teaching that the human body itself is the supreme temple of worship, rendering stone churches unnecessary.
The body as a temple.
Bernard himself was outspoken about the importance of the sexual instinct. He stated it was the animating impulse of all organic life, the fundamental source of all human endeavor, the most powerful factor driving human beings, and even the ultimate cause of man's most exalted thought.
So like Randolph and Crowley elevating the sexual instinct.
Yes, and arguing forcefully that modern Western culture's repression of this vital force was foolish and damaging. One of his disciples echoed this, describing Bernard as someone who truly recognized the inherent beauty and power of sex, teaching what they called the Oriental view of love, as opposed to the restrained Western idea. They saw it as akin to music and poetry, something capable of uniting individuals with the infinite.
Were there specific practices that caused controversy beyond the general free love accusations?
Oh, yes. Some of his specific practices were, even for the time, quite controversial. The sources mention his belief that sexually unresponsive women could have their receptivity improved by a partial clitoral circumcision, intended to expose the gland to direct stimulation.
Wait, what? Circumcision?
Partial clitoral circumcision, yes.
Yeah.
That definitely raised eyebrows, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
His wife, Blanche de Vries, also played a key role, teaching a tantric health system that was marketed specifically to wealthy women, arguing it could remedy various modern ills that stemmed from sexual repression.
Whole family business, almost.
Predictably, the press sensationalized Bernard's activities relentlessly. Reports described his practices as grossly licentious, venerating the goddess Shakti, and featured lurid accounts of couples allegedly making love hour after hour in his establishments.
The neighbors weren't happy.
Not at all. Neighbors in Nyack complained loudly about scandalous behavior, people in dishabille wandering the grounds, screams, and wild music emanating from the property.
Did the authorities step in?
Eventually. While Bernard's status as a big taxpayer in Nyack initially made local authorities reluctant to intervene, the mounting neighbor complaints eventually led to action. State police were brought in, and a raid was famously conducted on horseback, underscoring the drama and resistance Bernard's activities generated.
A horseback raid. Sounds like something out of a movie. Did it shut him down?
Not entirely. Despite the scandals and raids, Bernard managed to retire an incredibly affluent man living a lavish lifestyle. He became a patron of sports, particularly baseball and boxing, invested heavily in venues like stadiums and dog tracks, even built his own airport.
An airport.
And amassed a collection of expensive cars, including Rolls-Royces, Stutzes, and Lincolns. At his peak, his fortune was estimated at $12 million, a vast sum at the time.
Incredible. So what's his ultimate significance?
Our source material summarizes Bernard's lasting significance. He was a pioneer in transmitting elements of Tantra to America, fusing it with Western magic, and crucially, reinterpreting Tantra for a Western audience primarily through the lens of sex and pleasure.
And that interpretation stuck.
Largely, yes. This reinterpretation heavily influenced how Tantra was understood and presented in numerous popular books and movements that followed. He generated immense scandal, shaping the public image of Tantra in America as something exotic, seductive, and transgressive.
He is seen as a clear exemplar of that post-1890s shift towards the sexualization of love, and a figure who fully embodied the post-Victorian urge toward transgression described by Bataille.
But perhaps his most unique and lasting contribution, even more so than Crowley, was unequivocally foreshadowing the commodification of sex.
The business angle.
Exactly. His high-end clinics, his affluent clientele, his marketing of tantric sexual magic as a service for the elite.
Yeah.
This was branding and selling esoteric sexual practice for consumer capitalism.
Our source quotes sociologist Jeffrey Weeks on this, right?
Yes, arguing that in modernity, sex became something you buy, not just something you are. It transformed into a glossily marketed fantasy, with capitalism colonizing and expanding the realm of sex ever more exotically. Bernard's tantric order was an early, clear example of commercializing sex, packaging it as a spiritual good, promising both this worldly pleasure and otherworldly bliss for those who could afford it.
A potent mix of spirituality and consumerism.
So, bringing these three figures together, Randolph, Crowley, and Bernard, They offer us some incredibly powerful insights into the dramatically changing attitudes towards sex in the transition to modernity. They were, as our source aptly puts it, extreme embodiments and intense magnifying glasses that magnified the deepest tensions and contradictions of their age.
We can trace a progression through them. Randolph, embodying the late Victorian grapple with the sacredness and power of love within marriage.
Keeping it contained somewhat.
Crowley, representing the explosive post-Victorian urge towards transgression, deliberately shattering the productive social order through excess and ritual violation.
Blowing it all up.
And Bernard, vividly reflecting the growing trend towards the commercialization and marketing of sex in the early 20th century.
Packaging it for sale. But their significance isn't just historical. They directly foreshadow many of the sexual anxieties, fixations, and cultural phenomena we see today.
How so?
Our source points to the increasing influence of both Crowleyan magic and westernized Tantra in contemporary pop culture, spiritual movements, and new religions. Modern Tantra practices frequently mix elements from both these lineages.
And you see American Tantra as a brand.
Exactly. It's literally a trademark brand today, used to sell books, videos, and various sexual magical accessories. Bernard would probably approve.
Contemporary viewpoints, like that of Jeffrey Ty, quoted in the source, still echo the core belief of these pioneers.
Describing sex as potentially the most powerful energy available to humans, capable of creating any reality. This perspective often argues that traditional religion has suppressed what is seen as our inherent divine sexual nature.
So sex magic is still framed as liberation.
Very much so, utilizing the energy of orgasm to create desired reality and expand consciousness, seeing it as a moment when a window opens to the unlimited abundance.
Yet this brings us full circle back to Foucault's paradox of liberation. He argues that we haven't necessarily achieved true radical freedom around sex.
Right. Instead, we've continued and perhaps even intensified that long historical tendency towards preoccupation and discourse, constantly describing, debating, categorizing, and analyzing sex in endless detail.
Speaking of sex, Foucault suggests still feels like a transgressive act, like defying power structures. It carries the promise of intense bliss and links ideas of enlightenment, personal liberation, and pleasure.
But the reality, as the sources conclude, and as reflected in Bernard's legacy, is that this alleged liberation has largely manifested as an increasing commodification and commercialization of sex, often far beyond anything Crowley or Bernard could have fully imagined.
Sex sells everything.
Exactly. Media relentlessly uses sex to sell everything from cars to soda. Sexuality has pervaded public life and become a key category through which we understand identity and organize ourselves.
The 20th century, following the lead of figures like Crowley, certainly pushed the boundaries of sex to extremes of transgression and excess, seemingly trying to shatter every law and violate every taboo.
So the fundamental question these historical figures force us to confront is, in this process of relentless discourse, analysis, and commercialization, has sex lost its inherent magical power? Or has that power simply been redefined, perhaps harnessed more by markets and identities than by ritual and will?
It certainly remains a potent force, a tantalizing secret, a source of endless transgression and infinite debate.
Absolutely. We've taken a fascinating journey from the hidden practices of the seemingly buttoned-up Victorian era through the radical, boundary-breaking world of Aleister Crowley and into the burgeoning commercialization led by Pierre Bernard.
And reflecting on these historical trends gives us a crucial lens through which to examine our own contemporary understanding and experience of sex, its perceived power, the ongoing ceaseless discourse around it, and its complex entanglement with commerce and how we define ourselves in the modern world.
So here's a final thought for you to ponder as you wrap up this deep dive. If the Victorian era's alleged repression was, in Foucault's view, replaced not by silence, but by a ceaseless discourse and the eventual commodification of sex, have we truly achieved liberation?
Or have we simply exchanged one form of control and limitation, the taboo, for another, perhaps subtler one, the marketplace, and the endless consuming conversation?
What might truly harnessing the power of sex even look like today if it were somehow disentangled from both historical taboos and the consumer marketplace?